One of the things that has occurred a great deal since March and this pandemic began is reading. I still do enjoy reading, and I have for many years, but beginning in March I had more time to read and decided to devote myself to picking up a few more books and expanding my horizons. A little background, I kind of come by that naturally. My mother was an avid reader of any number of the books, westerns by Zane Grey in particular, but she was also very studied and would read a lot of religious materials. Well, one of the books that I have read lately is a book, and I'm not done with it yet, called Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. I'm also a history major, so this attracted my attention, and when I studied history, we often would go back and study some things, maybe ancient history, but I was more impressed with history that maybe were the last couple centuries that made a little more sense to me, that had a little more input into my current practice. In reading this book by Yuval Noah Harari, he's an Israeli-born person, first published this book in 2011 in the Hebrew language, translated in 2014 into English. Yuval Noah Harari. He goes back to the beginnings of what he thinks is human history, when we were hunter-gatherers, when we were out in places like this, looking around, trying to see and find ways to survive. And probably as well in very small groups or tribes, because you can't survive in huge numbers if you're spending most of your day running around the hillsides, the prairies, the forests, looking for things to eat. And so your time was occupied by doing those hunter-gatherer things. And then also part of that time, you tried to maintain the small tribe you were in, because there just wasn't enough food to be feeding, or enough wild animals to be feeding hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people. And so Dr. Harari talks about how that was a certain type of lifestyle. What happens, Dr. Harari says, is that as people begin to realize that they can domesticate some animals, that agriculture or farming can begin to be a significant part of their life, what happens is population increases. And as population increases, land becomes precious. And land, in some ways, becomes possession. Good example of that in Hebrew literature is when the wandering people get off of the wilderness and get into, so to speak, the promised land. Part of it was to kick out all the other tribes, to build up their boundaries, to make alliances, and to establish themselves as a powerhouse so they can have what they want. What Dr. Harari continues to say is that for this sort of thing to continue, or for large groups of people to exist together, there has to become some sort of common held myth or story that kind of overrides people into a sense of unity. Well, again, back into the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew scriptures, part of that would be that story that says God chose the Hebrew people, starting with Abraham, and God was going to bless them, and one of the blessings was to give them land, their own land. And so the perpetuation of that myth helps solidify a nation, helps them stand up against different enemies, helps them with a sense of hope that God's not going to disappoint them because God made a promise about a piece of land and people. Well, being a person who likes to read, part of the reason I like to read is it gives me time to think, because if you're just watching something like this video, it goes by pretty quickly. Think about it for a minute. What are the myths? Who tells them? And what is their purpose? So back to that sense of myth or story that helps keep people together, that one that God has provided a chosen people and that they deserve a certain piece of property. The myth has been perpetuated and lived, and I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's certainly had political ramifications. And when you think about the myth and why it's told and why it's retold at certain times, you have to ask yourself a question. Who's telling it or retelling it? What are the situations and who's benefiting from it? Usually, the one perpetuating the myth, or at least bringing it back up again, is the one who benefits from it in a significant way. In Christian tradition, there were 12 disciples. I would assume all of them were pretty good people in their own right, but only one became chosen, so to speak, to begin the church, Peter. So all of a sudden, Peter is the one who has the true church. And over the course of history, in our Western culture, that becomes the Roman Catholic Church. And so to be truly part of the real church, a priest would have to be ordained or blessed or have hands laid upon them by, you've got it, somebody who had hands laid upon them, blessed, whatever, reaching back to Peter. So there's this myth that somehow you're not a good priest or you're not a worthy candidate for the job unless you have somebody lay hands on you and bless you that can trace that same ordination blessing back to Peter. So who does that benefit? Obviously the priests. Is it harmful to people who follow Roman Catholic traditions, but even now a number of other Protestant traditions are picking up on the power or symbolic power or mythical power of ordination? Is it doing anybody any harm? I don't know. Take a look at how priests, pastors, others have been allowed to get away with things for decades, centuries, with that myth that they somehow are representatives of God in a more important way than anyone else. If you want to put it in a modern perspective, most of us probably have plastic in our wallets. You know, those cards that allow us to purchase things? That too is a myth. Those are a collective myth that says that card has value. And somebody's going to determine what the value is. In our culture, they call it a FICO score in some ways, but who determines that? And if I have a good FICO score and you have a low FICO score, does that mean I'm somehow better than you are? Biologically, no. But in a mythical world that says, here's how we all have to get along, here are the rules that separate us, yeah, somehow we've all bought into that idea. I want to read a quote to you from Dr. Harari's book, which I ask you to ponder a bit too with me. Most socio-political hierarchies lack a logical or biological basis. They are nothing but the perpetuation of change events supported by myths. This is one good reason to study history. If the division into blacks and whites, or Brahmins and Sudras in India, was grounded in biological realities, that is, if Brahmins really had better brains than Sudras, that's part of their caste system, biology would be sufficient for understanding human society. Since the biological distinctions between different groups of Homo sapiens are, in fact, negligible, biology cannot explain the intricacies of Indian society or American racial dynamics. We can only understand those phenomena by studying the events, circumstances, and power relations that transformed figments of imagination into cruel and very real social structures. There seems to be a fair amount of, if you want to say, disagreement, fighting, us and them. Who's got the facts, who doesn't, who's perpetuating what myth. What I asked in this whole process, and what I'm asking of you, is to just think about what are the myths that we believe in and hold so dear that if anyone tries to change them, we're going to lose something vital. I know we need structures that keep societies and groups together. But when those myths start to perpetuate a sense of injustice, when it begins to say, well, somehow a greater power, a God, somebody else has made those definitions that make one party better than another, and the one, again, who's making that distinction is usually the one in power, to keep down others who maybe want more power. Think about it. Look at history. Read and listen. Listening to another human being and their stories and their myths and their realities of existence is not going to harm anyone. For it is in reading, in listening, in thinking, in interacting where we can be broadened and find out that in many ways we're all in this together. At least biologically we are. Thank you for watching once again, and if you're curious, I've been meandering around part of Buffalo River State Park, rural Glendon, Minnesota.